Today is June 19th, 2019. My name is Blair Williams. I'm here today in the apartment of John. Is it Durnin? Okay. Um, so, first off, thank you, John, for having me here. And I normally like just to ask sort of how your family first came to Cumberland County.
Well, my family has been residents of Cumberland County since 1850 and probably prior to that. I think, as much as I know about the ancestry, that it was a case of coming from a Scotch Ireland area and more or less of an English background, although I do have some Dutch German blood in me.
Mm-hmm.
And my great grandfather, his name was Cornelius Durnin, and he lived on Harmony Hall Drive, back beyond the turnpike, the first farm beyond the turnpike.
Mm.
He and his mother-in-law had bought it in partnership after John was married to her daughter, whose name was Hetrick. My great grandmother's name was Hetrick. So we're long-time residents of Cumberland County.
Do you know how long your family lived on that farm?
Well, my grandfather lived on that farm, obviously, my great-grandfather,
Mm-hmm.
who was the one that originally purchased the farm. He evidently lived on it for, I would say, 40 years. My grandfather lived on the farm all his life, as well as my father, who, until his marriage, moved away and became a resident of some other place.
What was your grandfather's name?
My grandfather's name was John Martin Durnin.
And he married?
He married a Gensler. And her name, what was her name, Grace? I'll think of it in a little bit, but it escapes me at the moment. I had a little problem, as a lot of people do, with short-term memory, but
Sure.
I don't do too bad.
And then your father and mother's name?
My father's name was John Edward Durnin, and my mother's name was Laura Olive Paxton. So that's where the German-Dutch blood came from.
Yeah. And then I see you here, you're John L.
John L.
What does the L stand for?
Luther.
Luther, okay. So
Which, in fact, was what I went by until I was probably until I went in the Army. But that's a story in itself.
Well, I think I interviewed another resident here who also had a similar story, where he went by one name his whole life, and then he went to the Army, and the sergeant said that wasn't how it was done in the Army.
Right, that's exactly what happened to me, and I'll point it out to you. My father's name was John.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather's name was John. There was another line of the Durnin descent had a John in it.
Mm.
So there being three Johns, and I would have been the fourth John, so they chose not to call me in the family John, but they called me Luther, shortened to Lute.
Mm.
So I was Lute for quite a long time. And when I went in the Army, we had a roll call, and the sergeant of a platoon said, "When I call your last name, give me your first name and middle initial." So he called my name and I said, J. Luther. He repeated himself. He said, when I call your last name, give me your first name, middle initial. I said, John L. And I became John L. from then on. And that set a precedent where I was also John L. when I come out of the Army for my official records, Social Security, my employment name, and so forth. And it has always caused a little bit of problem because some people knew me as John and others knew me as Lute. But I got it worked.
Well, so you mentioned that your father moved off the family farm when he married.
Yes.
Where did he end up relocating to?
Well, that's another long story. Obviously, it was during the Depression.
Okay.
My father, like a lot of people, had trouble finding work. He worked in the sawmill. He cut up slabs of firewood and sold it on the streets. And he drove a truck for a local contractor, an old chain drive Mack truck with a dump bed on it.
Wow.
And he drove that for the contractor. He also would rent an apartment and sublet the second and third floor to make a living. So he scrounged around like a lot of people, and he made out. We weren't destitute, but we were poor. And after that, he became a town policeman. And he was a Carlisle policeman for 4 or 5 years. And it exposed him to a lifestyle that wasn't conducive to a good marriage. So that he and my mother had all kinds of problems and differences, and eventually they became divorced. So then he left town. Actually, he went down on the 941 road to NOLA and opened up a bar room. It was formerly a bar room called Mom Spades. And he and another man who was a short order cook ran the bar room until they had financial troubles and they got bankrupt. And he was in deep financial trouble. He was deep marital trouble. And I guess other troubles that I don't know about, but it caused him to leave town. And he left town for good, and my mother and father became divorced.
So what did your mother end up doing to support herself and her family?
Well, she worked for Dickinson College in a girls' dormitory on North Hanover Street, which is no longer in existence. It was right between Hanover Street and Fairground Avenue on a plot of ground there between that and the railroad track at Maslin's. And she was a housekeeper. And she scrimped along the best she could, and she had my sister with her, but my brother and I were no longer with her.
So where were you and your brother at this time then?
Well, after my father left town and my mother moved in with her mother on Factory Street, a lady came in her car and picked us up and took us out to the children's home in Carlisle, South Carlisle. It's now the funeral parlor of
Ewing.
That was a children's home back then.
Yeah.
And it was a Brethren in Christ institution. And my brother only lived there for a short while, but I lived there for several months. And which time I was in 7th grade, or just started 7th grade, and I went to Carlisle High School for a few weeks or months, and then I was in a foster home.
What was the children's home like? Those few
What
months?
is it?
What was the children's home like?
The home was, I would give it an A plus. Actually, the food was good, the care was good. The administrators there was Mother and Father Klein, and there was another woman that we called Aunt Hilda. They fed us well, they took good care of us, and I had sort of privileged status because I was one of the oldest children there. And I was allowed to leave on weekends and go see my mother, or all the way across town. They trusted me to go out on foot and back, and I would say they were outstanding.
How many children were there at any one time?
I would have to estimate that, but I would say that not more than 20.
And so they did a pretty good job of finding foster homes for...
I don't know the answer to that question. I know that they did for me, although it wasn't difficult. I don't think so. My brother went to a farm because he was older than I was. He was like 15. I was 11. No, he was around 14, and I was in the area of 11. I don't know whether it was more or less. I don't know whether it was more or less than 11. But my next home was a family that lived up above Centerville on Route 11 at that time. Let that go. It was Route 11 at that time. But it was my aunt and uncle. My aunt on my father's side. And my uncle was a night watchman at the Huntsdale Fish Hatchery.
Okay.
And I went to school in what was then a new consolidated school in Centerville. It was 1 through 8. And then when you finished, 1 through 7, and when you finished that, you went to Newville High School.
Yeah.
So that was the story of that.
So you went to the new high school in Newville, which is now the middle school. What was that like?
Well, I don't know. That's hard to describe. But basically, I got along. We had a principal there who was, I think he was a drinker, but that's only my opinion. And I had one teacher there her name was Miss Adams, who was very kind to me. And she was kind of like a guiding angel.
Is there any memory or individual aside from Miss Adams who really sticks out from your time there?
Yes, it's the only time I ever participated in any kind of organized sports, and it was very loosely disorganized because we had a baseball team. And we played,
Newville, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, and we played at noontime and recess and after school, and we had a very good catcher who graduated the year before and went to Newville for high school. And they needed a catcher, and I had never even caught a ball. But I volunteered, and I became a catcher on the baseball team. And it was sort of established a precedent for me because anytime we got into a pitching contest or anything, I was always the catcher. I was never the equal to my predecessor on the Centerville team because everybody acknowledged him as a leader. But I got along. And that's my outstanding memory from Centerville.
So from Centerville, you said you went to Newville?
No, I didn't. I went to Boiling Springs because after 2 years with my aunt and uncle there, I went to another aunt and uncle, and this time on my mother's side. They owned about 2 miles out of town on the Walnut Bottom Road. They owned a little gas station and grocery store, and I went there for 2 years. And while I was there, I went to Boiling Springs High School.
Is there anything that stands out from your time there?
Not much. Lunch period.
So 2 years at Boiling Springs, and then did you go back to Carlisle, or?
Beg your pardon?
So you said you spent 2 years in Boiling Springs. Did you go to Carlisle after that, or?
No, I dropped out.
Okay.
I dropped out of high school. I just started my 11th year in high school. I was still 15 years old. I had a slight altercation with my uncle, who really was my great buddy, and I liked him very much. But as a result, I became insulted, and my pride was hurt, and I decided that I was no longer going to be a foster child in that home. So I quit high school, and I went to work. I quit high school before I was 16 years old. Nobody ever come after me, so it worked out. But I went to work on a farm, and my pay was my room and board. So at that point, I was on my own, independent, and I never became dependent on anybody again except my wife.
I know how that is.
Yeah.
I'm assuming shortly thereafter you joined the Army.
Yes. When the war started in 1941, by that time my father had come in from Ohio and asked me to go with him, and I went with him. But he was terminally ill with cancer, and he had married again, and I guess he sort of had misgivings about abandoning his family, and he gathered me and my brother at different points in our lives, and he came and got us and took us out to Ohio. And I stayed there for part of 1940, and in 1941, the war started, December 7th, 41. And I kind of got homesick, even though home was just a delusion to me. I wanted to come back to Pennsylvania. So I told him, we went to work one morning, and we were in different rooms painting. And I decided I was going to come home. Then my next problem was how I was going to tell him. So my solution was to not tell him at all. I just walked out the door, and he was in another room. I walked out the door. I never saw him again after that. I went to the house where we lived. I changed clothes. I walked out of the highway and started to hitchhike, and I hitchhiked back to Pennsylvania. That was Mansfield, Ohio. It was 350 miles to Pennsylvania. It was New Year's Eve, and I started hitchhiking, and I hitchhiked home.
How long did that take?
Well, it started in the afternoon. I got to Canton, Ohio at 9 o'clock at night. I went to a police station and asked them if I could sleep there. They said no, nobody sleeps here except if you go on trial in the morning. So go to YMCA. Well, I had YMCA experience in Carlisle, and I knew that they closed at 9 o'clock, and I knew they also charged for the rooms. And since I didn't have any money, I started hitchhiking again. And I hitchhiked, maybe 10 or 15 miles to a small town. And it started to snow. So I walked out of town, and there was a cornfield there with shocks of corn in it, and I thought maybe maybe stupidly thought that I could sleep in a fodder corn.
Hmm.
But fortunately, a car came along and picked me up and brought me all the way home.
Wow.
The man that was driving the car was an oil field engineer from Oklahoma. He was working and he's going down to Philadelphia to the main line where his family was. And he went right down through New Kingston to where my mother was living on a farm at the time. And I told him to drop me off, and he dropped me off there. And I walked back to the farm and opened the door, went in, and laid down on a cot and went to sleep.
That was about New Year's Day then?
No, that was Christmas Day.
Christmas Day, okay.
So I was her Christmas present.
Yeah. So, all right, yeah, so, and then shortly thereafter, did you decide to?
Beg your pardon?
So, that would have been Christmas Day, 1941.
Yes.
How soon after did you enlist?
Well, I didn't get drafted until 43, or the early part of 43, but I tried to enlist in 42. I'd go to Harrisburg post office and lied my age. I said I was 18, but I wasn't. I was just 17. And I wanted to join the Marines. And I tried on 2 different occasions, but they had quotas and they had a protocol that they followed that didn't include me. So I waited until I was drafted, which was first week of March of 1943. And at that time, I went into the Army. I even volunteered then to go in the Marines, but they said they had a Perry County contingent that they wanted to keep open if anybody there, and it was the last position for Marines. So I could wait and go in the Navy. Every time they told me, well, you can go in the Navy, you can go in the Navy. Well, I didn't want to go in the Navy because I was scared of drowning. I was scared of sharks. I knew I could get killed, but I was a little particular about how it might happen.
Yeah.
And eating sharks wasn't one of them.
So you were drafted into the Army. Where did you go for training or basic?
I went to Joseph T. Robinson, Camp Joseph T. Robinson in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Okay.
We were there for 13 weeks. I was trained as a infantry combat medic. And we trained from then until about August in that thing, and then I went to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, at which time I was assigned to a station hospital, which I had no experience whatsoever in a hospital.
I was going to ask, did you take an aptitude test, or how did you get assigned to a medical?
Well, we had aptitude tests. I would say that they were like an IQ test.
Mm-hmm.
And once during my basic training, I was called out of a group of 11 out of a 200-man company, told to report for an interview with a board of interviewers, and it was for officer training school. Well, I was so young and so immature that I knew that I didn't want to be an officer, because it was an emotional thing with me.
Yeah.
But they told me I could come back for another interview, but I should get my feet wetter first. And that's how I missed becoming an officer, because it was my own choice. So then I continued being a grunt in the medical corps. We never had combat training. I never was in combat as a combat participant, because I didn't know how to shoot a rifle.
Mm. So they taught you how to save lives instead of.
Yes.
And so
The
you said
only
you were.
life I saved was my own.
Well, you were sent to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Is that where you ended the war, or did you also?
No. I was in the war for 34 months.
Okay.
Next stop was Camp Shanks in New York, which was a embarkation center. Got in a ship, went to North Africa, was in North Africa during the North African campaign. After that was over, we went to Italy. I missed Sicily because they had invaded Sicily and were successfully concluded in Sicily, and then I went to Italy. I went to Naples, Italy next, and I stayed in Italy for, I don't know, better than a year, maybe a year and a half.
During this time, were you staying in touch with your mother and brother and sister, or anyone else stateside?
No, very spasmodically. I only write a letter. I got one letter from my grandmother in 3 years, and I got maybe a half a dozen from my mother. But that's all. There was a beautician in Carlisle wanted me to write, and it kind of offended me, and I never did write to her. So, no, I didn't have any close correspondence.
Were you writing back to your grandmother and mother, or?
Oh, I didn't write often. I might have written, in the time I was in the Army, I might have written 4 or 5 letters in 3 years. I wrote one letter to my grandmother, which I still had a copy of it. Somehow I got a copy of it. Maybe she gave it to me or what, I don't know how, but I never saw any from my mother after that.
So you said you spent the majority of your time in Italy, in Naples, and is that right?
Yes. Well, no, we went to Naples and we bivouacked there for, I don't know, maybe a week. Then we followed the front line up to a town called Aversa.
Okay.
Which was about 20 miles north and east of Naples. And we set up a hospital unit similar to a MASH unit with tents and that sort of thing. And we operated out of tents for maybe 4 or 5 months. And then we occupied a sort of a makeshift hospital with buildings. That was the story there. It was kind of an evolutionary thing. We operated as at one level for a while, and then another level for a while, and another level for a while. The last level being German prisoners. But I had experiences in the tent hospitals that were bizarre, to say the least.
Were you finding that? I mean, were you dealing with the traumatic cases, or were you mainly just dealing with the?
Well, I can describe the first night I went into the tent hospital. It was the first hospital I was ever in, tent or otherwise. I was never in a hospital before that I knew of in my life, not even born in a hospital. So I was ill-trained because I was trained as a combat medic to be with a combat company, which is altogether different from the training you would get for a hospital.
Yeah.
And when I walked in the tent, the first night there, like I said, it was all new to me. I was alone in a tent with about 15 wounded soldiers. some of whom were German. First patient I had was a German who had to have treatment with a machine that was called a Wagenstein. And a Wagenstein was a manually operated vacuum pump that you used to siphon phlegm and saliva and whatever from his throat. And if the guy before me wouldn't have showed me how to use it, I would have never known, but I found out how to use it. And I did use it. And he asked about oxygen, and I said that they told me that they'd ran out of oxygen. And he said, in German, he said, "Nicht Oxygen, alles kaputt," which means that if he didn't get oxygen, he was going to die. And he did. About an hour later, he died, and I had to put him in a mattress cover, which was a difficult job because he fell out of the cot onto the grassy floor, and I struggled to get him back up in the cot. And then I ran for the OD, which was the officer of the day on duty, and he came over and we filled out what they called an EMT tag for him. And that got me through the first night. There were other nights that were just as goofy.
And this was in Italy, not North Africa.
What is it?
This was in Italy?
This was in Italy.
Okay. So you...
North Africa, I was just on what you would call bread run duty. I didn't do anything in North Africa.
So it sounds like you probably didn't have much time to keep yourself entertained. You're relatively busy?
Well, we worked 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 7 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we did find, you made good friends in the Army. I can't say that the Army and all soldiers had the same experience that I had, because I don't want to run the Army down. The Army was very efficient. It went from practically nothing in 1939. They trained with sticks because they didn't have enough weapons to train them with. And it went from that level in a short period of time to the most powerful army in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's a magnificent record. Yeah. And while my experience with the Army was never very commendable, it wasn't all the Army's fault. It was partly my fault too, because I was ill prepared.
Were there any other instances that really stood out during your time in the Army?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Next night or so, I had a German patient that had a cast-on leg cast that had a small hole cut in the cast with a bandage over it, and he was complaining fiercely about his wound. So I thought, well, I can't do anything worse than taking a look at it. So I opened the wound up and looked at it, and it was full of maggots. I called the officer of the day. He came in, and he took a very clinical interest in it, because that was the method used by some foreign units to prevent gangrene and keep the wound clean of debris. And we bandaged it back up again, and he just had to complain. Another time, I had a patient who had a catheter. The bottle was on the ground. He was in agony. We had a nurse by that time. She came in, and another corpsman and myself tried to find out what was wrong with it. Couldn't find out what was happening, but somebody unloosened the cap on the bottle that held the urine, and that released the pressure and he voided a great amount of urine into the bottle, and we found instant relief.
Mm.
So nobody knew what was going on, but we found out. It was interesting.
Yeah. What was it like during as your service was coming to a close? Was it a little bit easier, or were you worried about what the future was going to be like?
Well, my service didn't end there. Everybody in my unit had about 65 points, and you needed 70 points on a scale that they'd invented to release soldiers as civilians. Instead of releasing us and discharging us, we, as a unit, we were assigned to Japan.
Okay.
We left Italy, went through Straits of Gibraltar, across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, down to Hollandia, New Guinea. From Hollandia, New Guinea, we refueled, took on water. We then went to the Philippine Islands. We went to a staging area for the invasion of Italy, but in the meantime, they dropped a bomb, and the war became completed. But we still had to follow our orders to go through the invasion. So we were training on a portion of Philippines that was called Lingayen Gulf. And we trained there for boarding an LST. And on the LST, we went across the sea, past the island of Iwo Jima, and got in a strong typhoon, which sunk a lot of bigger ships than we were on. And it was a very hazardous place to be. We finally made it across, and we invaded Japan. Actually, it wasn't an invasion, but we had to find the city of Hiroshima. We loaded all the equipment, stuff on 6x6 trucks, and we drove cross country. Nobody knew where we were going. We found an MP at an intersection. He said, over that way. So we went over that way, and we wound up in Hiroshima. I walked on the sidewalks of Iwo Jima when practically the smoke was still coming off the ground. Not Iwo Jima, I'm sorry, Hiroshima.
Yeah.
I misspoke. I was thinking one thing, said another. But we were on ambulance duty in Hiroshima, and then I got reassigned with two other guys, and we went up to Tokyo, and I was assigned to a suicidal case up there because I had a lot of psycho treatment. I was a psycho attendant for quite a bit of time. And that ended when a friend of mine took the patient across the street to his quarters, and he shot himself with a .45 automatic, killed himself. That night I was on guard duty again, out in the boonies in a tin shack with a hole cut in the window for illumination, which had no paint in it. And the same major that I was with the night before while I was still alive was on the slab, and I was guarding him all night.
All right.
Yeah. What was Hiroshima like so soon after the bomb was dropped?
What was what?
Hiroshima.
Well, my immediate mental picture has to do with Japanese, very much infirm, wearing masks over their faces, white masks. I don't know where they got them. Just wandering around in a daze. There weren't a multitude of them, but there's enough of them, you know what I mean, that you saw them more than once. You saw them time and time again. But Then I would say my next impression was on the Japanese train. We went on through myself and two other guys went on a civilian train from Hiroshima to Tokyo. And I had one guy after the war argue with me, said that wasn't Tokyo, that was another city, but I said it was Tokyo, so that's where it was. Most of the time, I didn't know where I was at, I didn't know what I was doing there, and I thought the whole thing was useless. The only thing we accomplished was to show a measure of troops occupying their land, and that's what my duty was mostly, just to make a show of being there. Mm-hmm. Although I did have assignments at the time, and finally after Tokyo, I went up to Hokkaido, which is in the northern part of Japan, up where Mount Fuji is. Mm-hmm. And we were put in a great cavernous, big corrugated tin building that had no floor. It was all rocks for floor, and they had islands with coal stoves on to heat the place. Everybody stood around the coal stove in an overcoat. That's how you kept warm. But you have to remember that it was the very formative stages of our occupation of Japan, mm-hmm. and things were really crude at the time. And that's where I was when I was assigned to a ship to come home.
Did you have a lot of interaction with the people of Japan, or?
No.
You mainly kept your...
None. I had none.
Okay.
I mean, we couldn't talk to them. They couldn't talk to us. When we were on the train, on the civilian Japanese train, they were very afraid of us. Mm. They gave us a lot of elbow room, and yet the train was crowded. But we weren't crowded. The three of us, we could have gone like this, and we wouldn't have touched anybody because of their apprehension for what we might do to them, which was nothing, but we wouldn't have done anything to them, but they didn't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, the country of Japan was horrendous. It was a shambles. Mm. The city that we landed in from the LST was called Curie Naval Base, and it was flattened with bombs, and other cities were completely burned. I mean, they had paper houses mm-hmm. that went up in a flash, and it was bad. But I didn't stay there long enough because we just went there and did a couple things and turned around and were sent right home. We thought we were going to be sent home when we left the Panama Canal on a boat. And we thought, we'll make a right angle turn up to San Francisco. Didn't happen. They called a formation on deck of the ship. It was Liberty ship. And they said, we follow orders to what we were assigned to do, which meant we were going through with it. And basically, there was what you almost call a small riot on board ship, because this was, a blow to the sailors and the soldiers who were on ship. And the rebellion resulted in a lot of soldiers throwing their barracks bags, their rifles, their steel helmets, any equipment, threw it overboard. And no effort to stop them because we could outnumber the ship's crew, and that was that. I didn't throw anything overboard, but there was a lot of people did. And when we got to Manila in the Philippines, the first thing they did was reissued every bit of equipment that anybody asked for because it had thrown overboard to replenish his equipment, and they never charged a statement of charges or anything. There was never any charges, mandatory reprimanding charges or monetary charges. No charges whatsoever. You got everything back that you threw overboard, and got to thank you for it.
What were you thinking on the boat back from Hokkaido?
On the ship?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I was thinking, we went through an area where we had to turn back and look for a ship. It was sunk by mines. They hit a mine and it was sunk. And we had to go back and search for survivors, which we didn't find any. The second thing was that I was assigned to duty again to a psycho patient who was in a straitjacket. And I had a cot with sheets and a pillow, and the sailor gave me permission to go into I was on night duty, gave me permission to go into the galley and make myself fresh eggs and toast every night. So it was great. I really had because the ship was packed with soldiers, but I didn't have to worry about that because I was one of the crew. The crazy thing about being on shipboard was that I was afraid to go in the Navy in the first place because I didn't want to get sunk and float around and get eaten by sharks. But in the final analysis, I was spent 83 days on the high seas in the Army, more than a lot of sailors did.
Yeah. Did you arrive back in San Francisco?
Yep. We went back to Los Angeles, went in under the Golden Gate. Were met by a ferry of people who were waving flags and music was playing. And I thought, oh boy, they're out having a good time on Sunday. And it took me a while to realize that they were out welcoming us home.
Yeah.
And that was my mindset. You never expected to get any praise or thank yous in the Army, and here they were out in force welcoming us home. The next thing was we went out to an island in the Bay of San Francisco for Christmas dinner in 1945. And they had turkey and gravy and filling and pie and cake and ice cream, everything you could think of. They treated us like royals. And from there we went up to Sacramento and got assigned to, on New Year's Day, I spent in Sacramento, which was wall-to-wall servicemen fighting at every bar room. And I even got a punch from a sailor walking by one time. I just ignored it. But then I was assigned to an airplane. It was I can't remember it was a transport plane. Mm-hmm. It had bench seats in it, metal bench seats along each side of the fuselage. And it took us 7 stops to get from Sacramento, California to I'll think of the name of it, in Town Gap, where I was discharged. We stopped at El Paso. We stopped at Palm Springs, El Paso, another place I think it was Dallas, in Texas, Memphis, Tennessee, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Newark, New Jersey, and from there we went by train to Indian Town Gap, and that's where I was discharged.
Did anyone from your family meet you at Indian Town Gap, or did you have to?
Do what?
Did anyone from your
Well,
family meet you, or did you have to find your own way back to
the
Carlisle?
first family member about me was when I got there. We got there in the evening, and I called my stepbrother. He had a 1936 Ford Coupe, and he drove from New Kingston, Pennsylvania, down to an Indian Gap, picked me up. We'd come back up to Carlisle, spent the night up there carousing around, and basically I was AWOL. I went back down. Well, I went back down and I got in line to be get examined for discharge, and I was so sleepy I fell asleep. And I slept for a while, and I got up, got back in line. Then it took me so long to go through the line to get discharged. I had to stay an extra day in the Army because I went home when I wasn't supposed to.
They got their extra. They got that day out of you, or that.
Yeah, they got that day out of me. Then we went to we got that examination over with, and we went to a meeting in a big auditorium, and they told us what our obligations was and what our benefits were, and a whole bunch of stuff. And then they said, "Is there any volunteers?" And nobody volunteered. And one final stupid revolt against the herd, I stood up and said yes. And the whole auditorium burst out into boos and whistles and catcalls. But I spent 3 years in the reserve, in active reserve, in the Army after I was out. I don't know why, but I did. I only ever went to one meeting, and I was the only private there, and the rest were all officers. So all the privates declined to go in the reserves, and all the officers went in the reserves. That's the whole story. No more Army stories.
All right. So you got out of the Army. What happened next?
Well, I went to the unemployment office and got a job. Well, no, I didn't. I got a job as a hod carrier for a bricklayer, hoping to get trained for a trade, which I wanted to be a tradesman with the clearance that I could make a living. He kept me carrying bricks and kept putting relatives on the wall as apprentices for about a year, and I got tired of that and I quit. In the meantime, I met her, and somewhere along the line we got married. And when I quit the job of hod carrier, I went to the unemployment office and I said, "Yes, we got a job open at the Dickinson College raking leaves." And I said, "No, I don't want to rake leaves." "Well, we got another job sweeping sidewalks." "No, I didn't want to do that." Finally, he said, "Well, we got an interviewer coming in this afternoon who has a job opening for an estimator for an insurance company." I said, "I'll take it." So, well, not too quick, got to go and get interviewed.
Yeah.
I went and got interviewed, and the guy liked what I told him, and he said, "You come back this afternoon," he said, "we'll fill out the papers and get you going." And I was turning around to leave. He said, "By the way," he said, "you have 2 years of college." I said, "No." He said, "I'm sorry, we don't want you." So I walked out toward the exit door, and there's a guy sitting at a desk there, and I said, "I want to go to school. Where can I go?" I said, "I don't have a high school diploma." He said, "Well, we got a very good commercial school here in Carlisle." He said, "You can go there." So I went there, and she supported me while I went to commercial college.
For 2 years.
Huh?
For 2 years, I think.
2 years. And I got an associate degree level accounting certificate or diploma or whatever you're going to call it. And that's what I used to go to work. I went to work for Arnold Motors in Carlisle as a bookkeeper. I didn't know anything about bookkeeping because I wasn't a good student. I never was. I had learning disabilities. But I got the Chrysler Corporation manual out and I studied it for 2 weeks. I finally got the rudiments of what I was supposed to do, and I worked for him for 5 years. It was the best place I ever worked, but it was a big family, and I wasn't in the family, so there was no future for me. So I went to work at Hot Distributor. I wanted to go in business, and she wouldn't let me. She said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "I'm going to be a contractor." She said, "You don't know anything about building houses." She said, "How are you going to do that?" I said, "Well, I'm going to buy a wheelbarrow and a shovel, and I'm going to go to work with that and work my way up." But she won, so I went to work down at Hot Distributors in camp in Les Moines. And I worked for a man, his name was Jack Glenn. He was my boss. I worked there for 4 years, and lightning struck a place during my 5th year and burned the place down. So I was looking for a job, and I went to work after that for Amp Incorporated. And I had to fight my way in there because they didn't like my credentials. But I argued with them, and finally somebody granted me an interview, and he hired me. And I stayed there for 30 years.
Wow.
He was an accountant with them, and they found out.
I started out as a junior accountant, and I wound up 30 years later as manager of division accounting for a manufacturing division that had about 6 manufacturing plants and about 1,500 people. I was a top dog in accounting.
All on 2 years of schooling?
On an associate degree in accounting on a dropout high school diploma.
Yeah, it's impressive.
Said
impressive.
Yeah. I knew how to work,
It's
but I didn't know
here.
how to study.
You mean he
I hired dozens of college graduates, all of whom went higher up in the company than I did, which was saying something because that was executive level.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of friends. A lot of people helped me, and I helped a lot of people. I did good things for the company, too. They didn't all acknowledge it, but I introduced some things that they didn't know about.
Yeah. Well, I want to take a couple steps back, and you mentioned that when you were an apprentice, I guess you weren't an apprentice bricklayer, but you were working for a bricklayer. You met Grace over here, and I'm wondering how that happened.
At a roller skating rink.
Okay.
That's where everybody met everybody back then. There was about 6 roller skating rinks around here, and that's what the kids did.
I had worked at Willow Mill Park in the summertime or something like that, I don't know. And they had a roller skating rink there. And that's where I guess I met him, and it just bloomed on from there.
Well, they did do a lot of dancing, but I never was a dancer, except a 2-step. Jitterbugging was all the rage, and there was a place in Carlisle, I think it was called the Peerless, where the high school kids hung out after school, and they danced and, spent a little money, daggone little. And it was, in fact, run by a Mrs. Durnin, who was married into another branch of the Durnin family. Everybody said to me, "Are you related to those Durnin?" I said, "I never saw them. I never talked to them. I wouldn't even know them if they walked down the street." Because back in the 1850s, there was 2 brothers, Chris, what did I say his name? Cornelius and James. And they married different women and went different sides, and the family kept growing further apart. Now, I know one of the Durnins not out of the line very well, He happens to be my third or fourth cousin, and he married into the Finkenbinder family, which I was related to as well. My mother married a Finkenbinder, and I had stepbrothers and Finkenbinders, and they were close to me. We were always close. We were more like brothers than stepbrothers.
So how long did it take you to wise up and marry Grace?
Well, about a year. We were married in June the 6th of
April the 6th, 1947.
1947.
Okay.
And since I had gotten out of the service in January the 1st of 46, April the 6th of 1947 would have been about a year and 4 months, or 3 months, whatever. So that answers that question.
Now, when you said that Grace was supporting you when you were at the commercial college, did you also have the GI Bill, or was that?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So she was paying your living expenses.
It was meager, but it was.
Yeah, I worked at the Mechanicsburg Naval Depot and for some officers, and so I had a decent job there.
Did you keep that even after John graduated, or?
Up until you got pregnant.
Yeah, I guess I worked up until I was pregnant. Yeah, with Steve. Yeah.
After that, she stayed home with the children for a while. We had 2 children, Stephen and Janice. Stephen's deceased. He died in 2015 of pancreatic cancer, and Janice lives in Colorado. But she went to work for Cumberland Buildings, which was a company owned by David Rogers, a resident of Carlisle. They put up like prefabricated steel buildings. She was a company secretary.
I was the head honcho in the office.
She ran the office.
So you ran the company, essentially.
Well, yeah, in essence, yeah, I did a lot.
People said she did.
And he used to give me nice bonuses. You know, I mean, I was paid well, I guess.
Yeah. So you were living John's dream here of building houses, or of being a contractor.
Yeah.
That never really happened too much, did it?
She was a contractor and I was the accountant.
Yeah, we didn't build homes. We built business places like Earl's Furniture Store and different things like that.
They built the Sprint telephone building up in Carlisle. You know where that is?
Is it now the CenturyLink?
Yeah, it's now CenturyLink.
Yeah. Yeah, we used to build buildings even in the New England states. We had contracts all over
In
the
Florida,
place.
you built buildings in Florida?
No, not that I remember of, although we did in South Carolina because I knew they took me down. We had a company airplane and they took me down to one of the jobs.
So all the while you were at AMP, could you describe sort of what AMP did and sort of.
Oh yeah, everybody knows AMP around here because we built electrical connectors.
Okay.
AMP started out as a one-room building in New Jersey where they made a product that they called, I forget what it was called, it had a name, but actually what it was a little connector device on the end of a wire that instead of soldering it on, they had a barrel that they placed over the end of the wire, and they crimped that barrel. It was a crimped-on terminal. And a man by the name of Whitaker, U.A. Whitaker, who was a engineer for the Hoover Vacuum Company, I think it was, in New Jersey. He bought the one-room company in 1941. And he built that company from a one-room company to a worldwide industrial power that was a top manufacturer of electric products in the United States, well, in the world practically. And they innovated many, many kind of connecting devices that took molding and stamping and crimping and plating
gold and gold.
Gold. We were one of the 10 biggest gold users in the United States at one time. And we had companies all up and down the East Coast, or factories all up and down the East Coast and overseas as well. And U.A. Whitaker was just a genius as far as, managing and building a company.
In the meantime, he was an accountant always when he worked for Aunt.
We went over that, honey.
Okay.
Well, yeah, no. So I'm wondering, so you started as a junior accountant, is that right?
Right.
And you rose up through the ranks.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, sort of, how did the specifics of your job change with your job duties over time?
Well, it changed from mediocre, insignificant tasks like keeping track of how many sales we had for this, which was an adding problem, and it developed into what essentially was a budgeting process for the whole division. And I had to conduct meetings every month and every quarter. I had to go to plants to establish budgets. I traveled by plane to North Carolina, principally North Carolina, but I also had one trip out to the West Coast that was quite illuminating. But I would say then, after the budgeting process became old hat, the next problem came along was transferring all of our programs from manually calculation to computerized calculation. We went through the computer age, and that was about it. Can't think of anything.
You were, in doing that transition to computers, you were greatly involved in that.
Yes. I had a computer programmer, and we started out, the first computer we had, I heard somebody talking about, a few desktop computers, and what were they called? Something 2. Anyhow, I thought to myself, I wonder what would happen if I'd order a computer. So I wrote out a requisition, and I ordered a computer through purchasing. I didn't know whether to get a computer or get fired. Lo and behold, about a week or 10 days later, a computer arrived in my department. And I didn't know what to do with it, so I had a guy, Gary Smith was his name. And he was a graduate of Penn State, and I just hired him not too long before. And I said, Gary, do you know anything about computers? Yeah, he said, I know a little about them. I said, well, come in here and unpack this computer and see whether you can get it up and running. He said, okay. Lo and behold, he got it up and he got it running. It was an Apple II.
Yep.
And he got it running, and come in and he said, you want to look at it? I said, yeah. He had it on his desk, and I went out and I said, can you teach me how to run this thing? He said, yeah, what do you want to know? I said, how do you start it? He said, press this button. I was hooked. So from that point on, we did spreadsheet work. I could
Gazoo.
outdoor.
Yeah.
And after that, we got into standard costs, and we operated on what you call a standard cost system, which was an industrial engineering device that set up a hypothetical menu, and we costed those out by the hundreds of thousands. And in my division, and our manual operated standard costs were so antiquated that we still had standard costs that was 10 years old and the product wasn't even in existence anymore.
Boy.
So when corporate found out what we were doing with standard costs, they said, could we have your standard costs? I said, yeah. So they had them for about a month, then they came over and they said, could you give us a rundown at a meeting on your standard costs? I said, yeah. And after the rundown, he said, could we have your best man on standard costs come to corporate? I said, yeah. And that's how corporate went on to computerized standard costs. So that that was one of the things we did.
At AMP here in Carlisle, were there any traditions or jokes or that you were involved with at the office?
Any what?
Sort of like traditions that you were involved with at the office?
I don't know what you mean by traditions, but if you assume what was my interface or interaction.
Well, I'm just wondering, was there something that you did every year that was sort of unique to AMP? Whether maybe it was a holiday party, or not even unique, but was it a holiday party, or was there a...
Here in Carlisle?
Yeah.
No. We had a holiday party. We started out with a corporate level holiday party, and that went on the rocks. Then they said every division could have their own, and that started up a new tradition. But we would go to places like Zembo Mosque. They had a big place up there. We had a party up there. We had parties down in Stilton at the Stilton Firehouse. We had parties, I think, at the Hershey Lodge. But yes, that was a tradition that we were all involved in. Actually, I wasn't involved in it, but my career at AMP as an accountant more or less stopped because they wanted to introduce new blood, and they pushed me upstairs, and I was in the corporate headquarters office for 2 years.
Right before we retired. They saw his days ending there, so they had to get some
I
other...
was like a consultant, or they had another name for project manager. And we did like 5-year surveys and that sort of thing for the company.
Was this around like 1990, 88?
What is it?
What year was this around?
It was about 86.
86. Okay.
Yeah, I've been retired for as long as I worked.
Yeah. I was doing the math in my head earlier. You said you had worked.
I went there in 56 and retired in 86.
Okay. I think in my head I had you going there in 58, so I was a little bit behind.
Yeah, no, you were pretty close. I went to work in AMP in 56, and they went public with their stock in 56.
Okay.
Their stock was $50 a share, and any employee without expense could buy 50 shares. And some did and some didn't. Those that did never regretted it because it became semi-wealthy over it. It doubled and tripled and split and doubled and tripled and split until one share at $50 was worth probably $500
Wow.
after the splits and
Yeah.
so forth. It was voted one year by somebody on Wall Street as the #1 growth company in 10 years period, past 10-year period in the United States. #1 growth company.
Yeah.
That's not bad.
No, it's not.
Because we went from like $300,000 a month to multi-millions, if not billions of dollars a month.
Wow.
It was one of the greatest companies there ever was.
How long was Whitaker there for?
Well, not too long. He was there for probably, let's see, 41. He would have been 35 years, something like that.
You wrote a book on Whitaker.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But basically, maybe not 35 years. He turned the presidential over to a local person who was with the company from its inception. His name was Joe Brenner. I don't know if you ever heard of Joe Brenner or not. But he was born and raised right down the pike here.
Okay.
And Joe Brenner was the next president. Somebody asked Whitaker why he wanted Joe Brenner. He said, Joe knows how to take care of a dollar.
Oh, yeah, there were some
And
stories about
Joe was a company man. He could walk in any plant and practically know by first name a large portion of people in that plant. He was a personality on his own.
So you finish up with AMP in '86.
Yeah.
How did you spend your retirement?
writing a book.
Writing a book.
Well, the first thing we did was started to travel. And we traveled all over the United States. We hit every state in the Union except Hawaii and Canada or Alaska.
And I went to Alaska.
She since has been to Alaska, but I wouldn't go. I didn't want to go.
I don't know why.
And then we rented a double-wide manufactured home in Florida in Vero Beach. Lived in that every winter for 10 years. Played some golf and did some other things. She was more outgoing than I was.
I played bridge and that kind of stuff.
She was the extrovert and I was the introvert. And then I got on my bicycle one day and I said, took a ride to, they were building a development next door. It was called Vista Plantation. I went over there and I always told her, it's not a good deal to buy a place down here. I rode a bike over there. When I come back from a bike ride, I said to her, how would you like to buy a condo? She jumped about that high. She said, would I? So she always wanted one.
Yeah.
So we bought a condo, which I consider a poor investment. We sold it 3 years later, or no, 11 years later, and lived in it in the wintertime for 10 years. Every winter for 3 months. And we sold it for triple what we bought it for. So my terrible investment as an accountant turned out to be the best investment I ever made.
Yeah.
And he was my best investment. Yeah, we've had 72 years of marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
47.
Can you believe that?
I cannot. I just celebrated my 4th anniversary yesterday.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well,
So
you got a long way to go.
Yeah, I do.
We're oldies, but still kicking.
Well, the best thing I can say about being married is you got to be friends.
Yeah.
If you're not friends, you're dead in the water.
Makes it a whole lot tougher.
Yeah.
Anyway. So you were you spending? So you spent your winters in Florida in Vero Beach. Were you spending the rest of the time here in Carlisle, or?
Yes. Yes. I was involved in politics, not politics. I was a school board member
13 years.
for 13 years.
Carlisle.
Carlisle. Cumberland Valley.
Cumberland Valley. Okay.
And he was president.
I started in when Cumberland Valley was nothing but one-room schoolhouses. And I spent a lot of time on building buildings. In the last 2 years in Cumberland Valley, I was the president of the school board. So that was kind of similar to my experience with AMP, where I advanced through the ranks.
In fact, they had so many meetings that I used to accuse him, are you sure you're not dating some woman or something? You're going so many evenings of the week. But I found
I
out.
wasn't sure if I was going to school board meetings or running around.
Yeah, well, he was the president for so many years, and that he used to go to all the different boards meetings and stuff, and he was going a lot, but he was doing good.
Yeah.
So I still have him.
I know my boss went to Cumberland Valley School. She grew up in Middlesex, and her family, I think her grandfather was also in the Cumberland Valley School.
What's her name?
Her maiden name is Holtree.
Poultry.
Yeah, but I'm trying to think of what her grandfather's name was.
I knew a Holtree, but I didn't know him well.
Okay. I think her other side of the family might have been Rodaba, or that's.
Oh
that's
yeah,
not it.
Rodaba was in touch with you, Anna. There was an Anna Rodaba, and what was her husband's name? Dick? I don't know.
Dick Rodabach was on the school board.
No, I'm trying. I can't remember her mother's maiden name.
But she was in Middlesex.
Yes. Gutshaw.
Oh, yeah, we were
good friends with Gutshaws. Dick Gutshaw and Betty Gutshaw.
Dick
Yeah.
was on the board for a while, school board.
Maybe that was it.
Yeah.
What do you remember her first name again?
So my supervisor's name is Kara. Kara Holtree, and I think her mother's name is Kathy Holtree, Kathy Gutshaw, maybe.
Kathy Gutshaw, okay.
I'm not certain about that. So, but I know, and her uncle, I guess was told her stories of when Cumberland Valley was first a school district, and they used to
That sounds like Dick Gutshaw.
refer to it as Cow Valley, and
Yeah.
he was always upset that they were losing to Carlisle in football, and nowadays it's the exact opposite. So
Yeah.
he always rubs it in. So, yeah.
Did you go to Cumberland Valley?
I did not. So I actually grew up in Vermont.
Oh, okay.
So
Well, I think I've told you most everything that I can think of, unless you have something more you want to go.
well, no, yeah, actually, so what you mentioned that you built a lot of the Cumberland Valley. You oversaw some of its growth. I'm wondering sort of what those discussions were like.
Well, they were mostly with architects.
Okay.
And
They got rid of all the one-room schools, and
there would be there was a lot of discussion about the municipal bonds that we had to issue, because that was pretty important, as far as getting a good rating. But location was a big subject. Where do we want to put this school? Where do we want to put that school? And how big you want it to be? And
when were you on the school board?
well, I was just a member, and I was a committee chairman for a long time of different committees.
Okay.
But you were the president of the school board.
I know that. I don't like to emphasize that too much.
But I'm just wondering because did you see sort of the demographic, boom that eventually happened?
Well, that was a part of it. And, demographics weren't hard to figure out. The big growth was in the lower end districts. That was Silver Springs and Hampton, and to a lesser degree, the growth pattern in Middlesex and Monroe, it was significant, but it wasn't the main demographic, because Monroe and Middlesex were kind of like the farm district or urban area.
Yeah.
And Silver Springs and Hampton Township were the population centers. And that had an impact on where you're going to put schools. But the main high school, that was kind of a self-solving problem, because when we had the architect and everything ready to go, we had to say where it was going to be. It had to be what we thought was somewhat central to the entire district because of bus routes. It had to be in a fairly accessible area, and all that was provided when Max Tempt, a local industrialist or whatever you want to call him, donated, I don't know how many acres. It was more than 20. I'll say it was not less than 20, and I don't know how much more. But he donated that free of charge to the township if we would agree to build a school there, and that was right down where the high school is today, because his neighboring farm and home is right across on the other side of the highway. But Max Hempt was our benefactor at that time, and we grabbed it because it satisfied a number of conditions, such as financial, location, size, and all the things that we really were looking for in a property, and that's why we put it there. So it was a good decision.
Are there any board meetings or discussions that stand out in your memory?
Yes. I'll bring up one that never received a lot of publicity. Somewhere, the high school started out as a jointure, and the local districts still maintained their local boards, each township. Then came a point when we wanted to get away from that countywide organization structure into a more unified. So we were going to go from a jointure aspect and local aspect into a unified district, which included the locals and we had 21 or 22 board members when we first started out, because each township had 5 or 6 board members. Then when we reorganized, we took that down to from 21 units to about 6. But in the Cumberland Valley area, we had to reduce the school board members from 21 down to 9, which was kind of an arbitrary figure. And the allocation of the 9 school board members were Middlesex and Monroe combined had one director elected to the board, and Hampton and no, they had 3 directors, and Hampton and Silver Springs each had 3, which made 9 directors. Then, some point in time, pretty far down the road, Hampton said, "We don't have enough influence as much as we deserve on this school board. It's it's top heavy on other words besides ours. We want more school directors." And that became a bone of contention, which was finally resolved by maintaining the status quo. And it's been that way ever since. And I was involved in that because I could relate back the historical reasons why we went to a jointure in the first place, and that was because we had to send our kids to other school districts that charged us what they wanted, and we had to go by their rules, and we didn't want that. And when we discussed the number of board memberships and influence from each one of the districts in this thing, we didn't want to go back to where we were listening to somebody else having a major say-so of what was going to happen. We wanted it equal. It was maybe a little bit like the situation that we have nationally, where you have what do we call it when we have states? I can't say it. That was where my memory thing kicks in.
No worries. With the Senate, the Electoral College, or?
Yeah, Electoral College. It was like a deal with the Electoral College where the states wanted, more influence in the election process so that they weren't governed by the big cities with the population excess. That's probably a poor example, but it's the best I can come up with.
Yeah, no, I think it works. Well, let me just ask this: do you have any? Is there anything in any memory that stands out with Dick Gutshaw, or?
Yes, Dick Gutshaw was a prominent businessman. He owned and managed the Gutshaw Farm Equipment place. His family and my family were old friends. And I had a great relationship with Dick's father, who was Harris Gutshaw.
Okay.
And Harris used to supply my family, when I say my family, Grace and I and our kids, with dogs when we needed them. He was like a dog guy. He always had a puppy to give away, and we were always the recipients. And his dad and my dad were good friends when they were younger, and so we had a good, close relationship with the Gutshaws. And we still see Betty today. She's living. He isn't.
Dick's gone.
She's over in what?
I forget the name of it. The home.
She's in another nursing home in Carlisle.
Okay. Well, I always end by asking, and Grace, this can include you as well. Is there anything I should have asked or that you want to say before I turn the camera off?
I will say another thing. You asked about what I did in Florida to spend my time when I didn't. I only golfed once a week, and she went out every day.
Played bridge.
My daughter asked me one time to make a record of some of the stories.
Okay.
I started to write. I had a computer. I started to write different stories that she found interesting. And when I started to write, I thought, well, if I would organize these would become sort of an ongoing record. And I did that, and I enjoyed it. And as a result, I self-published a book of my memoirs. It's called Walking the Big Valley. And Walking the Big Valley never made me a cent in royalties or
Well, he
anything.
never tried to sell it.
But I've given away about 100 of them. And I even gave one to the Historical Society, and the girl I talked to wasn't very impressed with it. Maybe sign a release. And that's the last I ever heard of it. So it's buried in your files someplace.
All right, well, I'll take a look for it.
See if you can find it.
Yeah, I will. And if not, I'll ask for another copy.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'd be glad to give you a copy.
Sure.
Do you want a copy now?
Well, let me double check, see if we already have it, and if we do, I'm sure we do.
Well, you must have a cataloging system.
We
there.
do, yeah. So I will check the catalog, and if for some reason it's been misplaced, when I drop off the DVD, I'll
Well,
ask
I
for a
wasn't
copy.
sure whether she was going to put it on the shelf or drop it into the wastebasket, but that was kind of her.
Yeah, but it's
We changed a little bit over the years.
Pardon?
I said we've changed a little bit as an organization over the years.
Yeah, well, that's maybe good, really. Because there's a lot of good information in that book. I think.
Well, a lot of
I'm
people enjoyed
prejudiced.
reading it. I'll
Well,
say
yeah,
that.
no, just from our conversation, I can tell that it's probably a good read.
Okay.
Now, is that the book you mentioned, Grace? The biography of Whitaker, or is that?
That wasn't a biography.
that's
It was-
another book he wrote.
When I wrote that book, and the guys at work seen it, they said, "Why didn't you write about your work?" So I said, "I have to write about that." So I wrote it's a booklet. It's not a book. It's a
Pamphlet.
booklet that deals with the origin of the company and some
Okay.
of my experiences in the company. I also wrote a novel.
Hmm.
The novel, I got a copy. I got a request from the self-publishing company that said that they would like to put it in a contest or whatever you call
Whatever they call it, the grade
it,
books.
in the state of Colorado. About a month later, I got a memo that said, and a couple other things that said, your book has won first place in the Literary Society in the state of Colorado.
Wow.
Yeah, and he has a certificate, but we ought to have that hanging up someplace, but we don't.
Yeah. So I wrote 3 books, really.
Okay. And was the Walking a Big Valley the only one you gave to the Historical Society?
Yes.
Okay.
The others I didn't.
Okay.
They're all available on Amazon.
Are they? Well, I'll take a look for them then.
Just put in J.L. Durnin or Big Valley, and they'll come up.
Okay. Again, Grace, John, thank you so much for inviting me into your home today. It's